You think Roman emperors were noble warriors? Try explaining to your kids why Nero castrated a boy to make him his wife. Forget everything Hollywood taught you about ancient Rome. Those gladiator movies with their heroic emperors and romantic storylines. Complete fantasy. The real Roman Empire was a sexual nightmare that would make modern scandal sheets look like children's books. We're talking about systematic abuse, child trafficking, and sexual horrors so twisted that even Romans themselves were shocked. You're about to discover how the most powerful men in history used their absolute authority to commit acts that would land them in prison today. We'll explore marriage contracts that were basically slavery documents, emperors who held wedding ceremonies with castrated boys, and a systematic abuse network that stretched across the Mediterranean. These aren't fairy tales or Hollywood dramatizations. These are documented historical facts that historians have been quietly studying for decades. The sexual corruption we're about to uncover didn't just destroy individual lives. It literally brought down the greatest empire in human history. By the time we're done, you'll understand how bedroom politics became the hidden force that tore Rome apart from the inside. We'll examine specific cases documented by Roman historians themselves, look at archaeological evidence that confirms the worst stories, and trace how sexual abuse became so normalized that it infected every level of Roman society. From Julius Caesar's shocking sexual reputation to Emperor Caligula's incestuous relationships, from the systematic rape of conquered peoples to the legal framework that made women property, we're going to expose the dark reality behind Rome's golden facade. You'll learn about the pederasty networks that connected politics and child abuse, the imperial brothels that operated in the heart of government, and the succession crises that tore the empire apart when sexually damaged heirs tried to rule. Before we dive into these disturbing historical facts, do me a quick favor, smash that subscribe button, hit like if you're ready for some shocking Roman history, and drop a comment telling me what's the most twisted thing you've heard about ancient Rome. I love seeing where my history lovers are watching from around the world. Now let's uncover the sexual nightmares that brought down an empire. Here's what they don't teach you in history class. Romans didn't care if you slept with men or women. They cared about who was on top. In Roman society, sexual identity had nothing to do with gender preference and everything to do with power dynamics. The entire system was built around one simple rule. The person with more social status, wealth, or political power was expected to be the dominant partner in any sexual relationship. This wasn't just bedroom politics, it was the foundation of their entire social order. Think about how twisted this was. A wealthy Roman man could sleep with male slaves, female servants, or anyone beneath his social class, and society celebrated him as masculine and powerful. But if that same man was ever discovered being the submissive partner with anyone, male or female, his career was over. His reputation was destroyed. His family name was ruined. The hierarchy was brutally simple. Adult Roman men at the top, then women, then young men, then slaves at the bottom. Your position in this sexual pecking order determined your entire life. Women were always expected to be submissive no matter who they married. Young men, especially teenagers, were fair game for older, more powerful men. And slaves? They had no choice at all. This created a system where sexual relationships became weapons of social control. Powerful men didn't just have sex, they used sex to demonstrate their dominance over everyone around them. Every sexual encounter was a power transaction, a public display of who controlled whom. The most socially acceptable form of male homosexual relationship was called pederasty, older men mentoring teenage boys. But mentoring meant something very different than what we'd consider appropriate today. These relationships typically involved men in their 30s or 40s, forming sexual bonds with boys as young as 14 or 15. The Greek influence on Roman culture had normalized these relationships to the point where they were considered essential for a young man's education. Roman society didn't just tolerate these relationships, they encouraged them among the elite. Wealthy families would actually compete to have their teenage sons chosen by powerful older men. Why? Because these sexual relationships came with political connections, career opportunities, and social advancement. Parents literally sold their children's bodies for political gain. The practice was so common that Roman literature is filled with references to it. And wealthy households routinely included teenage boys, specifically for the sexual pleasure of adult men. Consider the systematic nature of this abuse. Roman households maintained what they called catamites, young male slaves specifically kept for sexual purposes. These boys were often castrated to preserve their youthful appearance and prevent them from developing adult masculine characteristics. They were bought and sold like any other property, often for enormous sums of money. The most beautiful boys could cost more than a house, and wealthy Romans would compete to own the most attractive child sex slaves. But here's where it gets truly sickening. Adult men who took the submissive role in these relationships faced complete social destruction. If a grown Roman man was discovered being penetrated by anyone, even his own wife, he could lose his citizenship, his property, and his family. The punishment was so severe that some men committed suicide rather than face the shame. Roman law specifically prohibited adult male citizens from being sexually submissive, making it a crime punishable by exile or death. The legal framework around this is horrifying. Roman courts regularly heard cases about sexual positions and dominance. Witnesses would testify about who was on top during sexual encounters. Legal documents exist detailing the specific sexual acts that different classes of people were allowed to perform. The state literally regulated sexual positions based on social class, age, and citizenship status. Julius Caesar himself was destroyed politically by rumors that he had been the submissive partner in a relationship with King Nicomedes of Bithynia. His political enemies never let him forget it, calling him the Queen of Bithynia in the Senate and suggesting he was unfit to rule because he had been sexually dominated by another man. Even Caesar's military victories couldn't overcome the political damage from these sexual allegations. Roman soldiers would sing songs mocking their general's supposed sexual submission, and the rumors followed him throughout his entire career. The details of Caesar's alleged relationship with Nicomedes are absolutely devastating to his reputation. When Caesar was a young diplomat in his early 20s, he was sent to the court of King Nicomedes IV in Bithynia to negotiate a naval alliance. What should have been a routine diplomatic mission turned into a sexual scandal that would haunt Caesar for the rest of his life. According to contemporary accounts, Caesar stayed at Nicomedes' court far longer than necessary for diplomatic business, and Roman observers noted that he was treated more like a royal consort than a diplomatic representative. The king showered Caesar with expensive gifts, including purple robes, gold jewelry, and a personal bodyguard, treatment typically reserved for royal spouses or favored lovers. Caesar was given his own luxurious quarters within the royal palace and was seen accompanying the king to private dinners and intimate court functions. Most damaging of all, witnesses reported that Caesar would arrive at official court ceremonies wearing makeup and perfume, dressed in silk garments that emphasized his youthful appearance. When Caesar finally returned to Rome, his political enemies immediately seized on these observations to destroy his reputation. Marcus Bibulus, Caesar's lifelong political rival, was the first to publicly call him the Queen of Bithynia during a heated Senate debate. The accusation was so shocking that the entire Senate fell silent, and Caesar's face reportedly turned bright red with humiliation. From that moment forward, every political speech Caesar gave was interrupted by senators making jokes about his alleged sexual submission to a foreign king. The sexual mockery became so intense that it affected Caesar's ability to function as a politician. During one famous Senate session, when Caesar was arguing for increased military funding, Senator Curio stood up and sarcastically asked if the queen thought her husband King Nicomedes would contribute ships to the Roman navy. The entire Senate erupted in laughter, and Caesar was so humiliated that he stormed out of the chamber without finishing his speech. But the worst damage came from the soldiers under Caesar's command. Roman military culture was obsessed with masculine dominance, and soldiers had no respect for commanders who were seen as sexually submissive. Caesar's legions created dozens of crude songs, mocking their general's supposed sexual relationship with Nicomedes. One particularly popular song, which historians have preserved, went, "Caesar conquered Gaul, but Nicomedes conquered Caesar. Caesar leads in triumph, but once he followed behind." These songs became so widespread that they were sung not just by Caesar's own troops, but by soldiers throughout the Roman army. During Caesar's triumphant parade celebrating his conquest of Gaul, his own soldiers sang these humiliating songs as part of the celebration. Roman military tradition allowed soldiers to mock their commanders during triumph parades, but the sexual nature of these songs was unusually cruel and persistent. The political damage was enormous and long-lasting. Even after Caesar became one of Rome's greatest military heroes, conquering Gaul and defeating Pompey in civil war, his enemies continued to use the Nicomedes rumors against him. When Caesar was appointed dictator, Cicero wrote letters to his friends joking that Rome was now ruled by Nicomedes' former queen. The rumor was so persistent that historians writing decades after Caesar's death still felt compelled to address it in their accounts of his life. The sexual allegations also affected Caesar's relationships with other powerful Romans. When he formed the first triumvirate with Pompey and Crassus, both men privately expressed concerns about being associated with someone who had such a damaged sexual reputation. Crassus reportedly joked to friends that he was nervous about turning his back on Caesar during their private meetings, suggesting he feared Caesar might try to sexually dominate him as well. Most tragically, the rumors may have contributed to Caesar's assassination. The conspirators who killed him, led by Brutus and Cassius, claimed they were saving Rome from a tyrant. But their private letters and conversations, preserved by historians, show they were also motivated by disgust at being ruled by someone they considered sexually degraded. Brutus wrote to a friend that he couldn't bear the thought of Rome being governed by a man who had been used like a woman by a barbarian king. The irony is that Caesar spent his entire adult life trying to overcome these sexual allegations through displays of hypermasculine behavior. His numerous affairs with married women, including Cleopatra, were partly motivated by a desperate need to prove his sexual dominance. His military campaigns in Gaul, where he slaughtered over 1 million people, were driven partly by a need to demonstrate masculine brutality that would overshadow the rumors about his youthful submission. Even Caesar's famous relationship with Cleopatra was tainted by the Nicomedes scandal. His enemies claimed that Caesar was attracted to Cleopatra because she reminded him of his former lover Nicomedes. Both were foreign royalty who dressed elaborately and wore makeup. Roman graffiti from the period, preserved in Pompeii, shows crude drawings of Caesar dressed as a woman serving both Nicomedes and Cleopatra, suggesting that ordinary Romans saw all his relationships through the lens of sexual submission. The Nicomedes affair demonstrates how completely Roman sexual culture was based on power and domination rather than affection or attraction. Caesar's alleged relationship with the king wasn't scandalous because it was homosexual. Romans regularly had male lovers. It was scandalous because Caesar had allegedly taken the submissive role with a foreign king, which suggested he could be dominated by Rome's enemies. In Roman thinking, a man who could be sexually dominated couldn't be trusted with political or military power. This sexual paranoia had devastating consequences for Caesar's effectiveness as a leader. He spent enormous amounts of time and energy trying to prove his masculine dominance instead of focusing on governing. His need to constantly demonstrate sexual power led him to make increasingly reckless political and military decisions. The man who might have been Rome's greatest leader was psychologically damaged by sexual rumors that prevented him from reaching his full potential. Imagine living in a society where your sexual position determined your legal rights, where being on the bottom in bed meant being on the bottom of society, where parents encouraged their teenage children to have sexual relationships with older authority figures, where rape was perfectly legal as long as you were raping someone with less power than you, where the state maintained detailed records of who was allowed to penetrate whom, and violation of these sexual hierarchies could result in execution. This wasn't just ancient weirdness, this was a systematic method of social control that kept the powerful in power and the weak submissive. Sexual dominance became the ultimate symbol of political authority. Roman literature, art, and graffiti are filled with images and stories celebrating sexual dominance as a form of power. Archaeological evidence from Pompeii shows homes decorated with explicit sexual artwork designed to demonstrate the owner's dominance over his household. The psychological damage this system created was enormous. Children were raised from birth understanding that their sexual autonomy could be bought and sold. Boys knew they might be sexually used by older men until they reached adulthood, at which point they were expected to become sexual predators themselves. Girls knew they would be sold into sexual slavery disguised as marriage. The entire population lived under a system where sexual violence was not just normalized, but legally mandated. But this systematic sexual abuse got even worse when you add the nightmare of Roman marriage politics. Roman marriage wasn't about love, it was about buying and selling human beings with legal paperwork. Forget every romantic movie you've ever seen about ancient Rome. Roman marriage was a business transaction where fathers sold their daughters to the highest bidder. The girl's opinions, feelings, or desires were completely irrelevant. She was property to be traded, and the marriage contract was basically a receipt. These contracts detailed exactly what the husband was purchasing: the girl's body, her future children, her labor, and her complete obedience. Roman law was crystal clear. Women had no legal rights once they married. They couldn't own property, couldn't make legal decisions, couldn't even leave the house without their husband's permission. A Roman wife was essentially a slave with a fancier title. Her husband could beat her, rape her, or sell her belongings, and there was absolutely nothing she could do about it. If she complained, her own family would side with her husband to protect the business relationship. Most Roman girls were married off between ages 12 and 14, before they even understood what was happening to them. Their wedding day wasn't a celebration, it was the day their childhood officially ended and their life of sexual servitude began. These weren't mature women making informed choices. These were children being sold into sexual slavery by their own families. The marriage ceremonies themselves were designed to emphasize the transfer of property. The bride was literally handed from her father to her husband like a business transaction. She had no voice in the ceremony, no opportunity to refuse, and no legal recourse if she changed her mind. Roman wedding rituals included symbolic acts of capture and submission, making it clear that the woman was being conquered rather than choosing a partner. The daily reality for Roman wives was a living nightmare. They spent their entire lives either pregnant or recovering from childbirth, which was one of the leading causes of death for women. With no birth control and husbands who considered sex a marital right regardless of consent, most women were constantly trapped in a cycle of dangerous pregnancies. Roman medical texts from the period document the horrific injuries women suffered during childbirth and the complete lack of medical care available to them. Archaeological evidence from Roman graveyards shows the brutal reality of this system. Female skeletons from the Roman period show evidence of multiple pregnancies, malnutrition, and injuries consistent with domestic violence. The average lifespan for Roman women was significantly shorter than for men, primarily due to the dangers of constant pregnancy and abuse. Tombstone inscriptions often celebrate women who died young in childbirth as fulfilling their duty to their husbands. They couldn't leave the house without permission, couldn't speak to other men, couldn't manage money, couldn't make decisions about their own children, couldn't even choose what to wear. Their entire existence revolved around serving their husband's needs and producing male heirs to continue his family line. Roman household manuals that have survived describe wives as property to be managed, with detailed instructions on how to control their behavior, limit their freedoms, and punish them for disobedience. But here's the cruelest part. While wives were trapped in this prison of absolute submission, their husbands were not just allowed, but expected to have sexual relationships with other people. Roman men routinely kept mistresses, visited prostitutes, and had long-term affairs with both men and women. This wasn't considered cheating. It was considered normal masculine behavior. Roman legal documents exist that specifically protect a husband's right to sexual relationships outside marriage while criminalizing any sexual autonomy for wives. Roman wives had to watch their husbands parade their lovers around publicly while they sat at home, pregnant and powerless. They had to smile and play the perfect wife while their husband spent the family money on courtesans and brought his male lovers to dinner parties. They had to pretend everything was fine while their husband's sexual adventures humiliated them in front of the entire community. Roman literature includes countless examples of wives being forced to serve dinner to their husbands' lovers, clean up after their sexual encounters, and even help arrange their affairs. The legal system offered no protection. Divorce was theoretically possible, but only if the husband agreed to it. A woman couldn't divorce her husband no matter how badly he treated her. If she somehow managed to escape, her father could legally drag her back to her husband's house. If she had children, she would never see them again. They belonged to the father's family, not hers. Roman legal codes specifically state that children are the property of their father, and that mothers have no parental rights whatsoever. Even more horrifying, Roman law allowed husbands to kill their wives for suspected adultery without any legal consequences. A husband could murder his wife based on nothing more than suspicion, and the courts would consider it justified. But if a wife killed her husband, even in self-defense, she would be executed along with any accomplices. Roman legal records document hundreds of cases where wives were murdered by their husbands for imagined sexual transgressions. The economic aspects of this system were equally brutal. Wives brought dowries to their marriages, but once married, they had no control over this money. Husbands could spend their wife's dowry on mistresses, gambling, or any other purpose, leaving the wife destitute. If the husband died, the wife often found herself homeless and penniless, as all property passed to male relatives. Roman legal documents show countless cases of elderly women dying in poverty because they had no legal right to their deceased husband's property. Roman society had created a system where half the population lived in permanent sexual slavery, and everyone pretended this was normal and moral. These women weren't just trapped in bad marriages, they were trapped in a legal framework that treated them as subhuman. The psychological damage this created was generational, as mothers had to raise daughters knowing they were preparing them for a life of sexual servitude. But this legalized abuse of women was nothing compared to what emperors did when they had unlimited power. Absolute power didn't just corrupt Roman emperors, it turned them into sexual monsters that shocked even their own people. When you're the most powerful person in the known world, normal sexual relationships become boring. Roman emperors had access to anyone they wanted, anytime they wanted, with no consequences. This level of sexual power created behavior so twisted that it defied comprehension. The imperial court became a playground for sexual experimentation that would horrify modern psychiatrists. Take Emperor Hadrian, who ruled from 117 to 138 AD. Everyone knows him for building Hadrian's Wall in Britain, but historians quietly ignore his disturbing obsession with a teenage boy named Antinous. This wasn't a normal relationship by any standards. It was a grown man in his 50s becoming sexually obsessed with a boy who was probably around 16 when it started. Hadrian didn't just have a sexual relationship with Antinous, he became completely obsessed with him. He dragged the boy across the entire empire on his travels, spending more time with his teenage lover than with his own wife. Court records show that Hadrian would cancel important political meetings to spend time with Antinous. He commissioned hundreds of statues and paintings of the boy, displaying them throughout the empire like some kind of creepy shrine. The relationship was so inappropriate that even Romans who tolerated pederasty were uncomfortable with it. Antinous was already too old for a traditional pederastic relationship, but Hadrian kept him as a sexual companion well past the age when such relationships were supposed to end. Roman writers of the time described the emperor's behavior as obsessive and inappropriate, noting that he treated the boy more like a wife than a temporary sexual partner. When Antinous mysteriously drowned in the Nile River in 130 AD, many historians suspect suicide or even murder. Hadrian's reaction was beyond disturbing. He founded an entire city at the spot where the boy died, naming it Antinopolis. He had Antinous declared a god and ordered temples built for his worship throughout the empire. He put the dead boy's face on Roman coins and forced citizens to participate in religious ceremonies, honoring his dead teenage lover. This wasn't grief. This was a powerful man using the resources of an entire empire to create a cult around his sexual obsession with a child. Imagine if a modern leader used tax money to build cities and temples dedicated to their dead teenage boyfriend. The scandal would destroy them, but Hadrian had enough power to force an entire civilization to participate in his sick fantasy. The cult of Antinous became one of the largest religious movements in the Roman Empire, with thousands of temples and millions of worshippers forced to honor a dead teenage boy. But Hadrian's obsession looks almost normal compared to Emperor Nero's sexual madness. Nero didn't just have male lovers, he held actual wedding ceremonies with them, complete with wedding dresses and public celebrations. These weren't private affairs, but massive public spectacles designed to normalize imperial sexual abuse. In 64 AD, Nero married a former slave named Pythagoras in a full Roman wedding ceremony. But here's the twist that shocked even Romans. Nero played the role of the bride. The Emperor of Rome, the most powerful man in the world, put on a wedding veil and walked down the aisle to marry a male slave. He legally adopted the submissive role that was supposed to destroy a man's reputation, and nobody dared say anything because he was the emperor. The ceremony was conducted with all the traditional Roman wedding rituals, including the exchange of rings, the sharing of cake, and the public consummation ceremony that Romans required for legal marriages. Contemporary accounts describe how Nero acted like a blushing bride, allowing himself to be carried off by his new husband in a parody of traditional Roman marriage customs. The entire imperial court was forced to attend and pretend this was normal. A few years later, Nero held another wedding ceremony, this time marrying a young slave boy named Sporus. This marriage was even more disturbing because Nero had the boy castrated before the ceremony. He literally had a child surgically mutilated so he could keep him as a permanent wife. Sporus was forced to dress as a woman, take female names, and appear in public as Nero's empress. Think about how twisted this was. Nero used his imperial power to force a child to undergo surgical mutilation for his sexual pleasure. He turned marriage ceremonies into public displays of his sexual dominance over children. He used the most sacred Roman institutions to normalize his abuse of minors. The castration was performed without anesthesia, and contemporary accounts describe Sporus's screams echoing through the imperial palace. After the castration, Nero dressed Sporus in women's clothing and jewelry, forcing him to appear at public functions as the emperor's wife. Roman citizens were required to bow to this castrated child as they would to an empress. Foreign ambassadors had to conduct diplomatic negotiations while pretending that a mutilated teenage boy was the legitimate spouse of the Roman emperor. The really horrifying part is how the Roman system enabled this behavior. Court officials, senators, and military leaders all participated in these ceremonies because opposing the emperor meant death. They brought wedding gifts to celebrate Nero's marriage to castrated children. They attended dinner parties where Nero's boy wives were displayed like trophies. They created a culture where imperial sexual abuse was not just tolerated but actively supported. Roman historians document how the imperial court became a horror show of sexual violence. Senators' wives were forced to watch their husbands celebrate the emperor's marriage to children. Military commanders had to swear loyalty oaths to castrated teenagers. Religious officials had to perform sacred ceremonies blessing the emperor's abuse of minors. The entire government apparatus was transformed into a machine for enabling and celebrating sexual crimes. But Nero's sexual madness went beyond just his marriages. He regularly raped both men and women at court functions, often in front of their spouses and families. He would select victims during dinner parties and assault them while other guests were forced to continue eating and pretending nothing was happening. Contemporary accounts describe how court functions became terror sessions, where no one knew if they or their family members would be sexually assaulted before the evening ended. Emperor Caligula took imperial sexual abuse to even more horrifying levels. He not only sexually abused his sisters, but forced them into prostitution, selling their bodies to other senators and foreign dignitaries. He turned his own family members into sex slaves and used their rape as a tool of political control. When senators opposed his policies, he would force them to watch their wives and daughters being sexually assaulted by guards. Caligula also created what he called pleasure gardens throughout Rome, where children were kept for the sexual entertainment of the imperial court. These weren't hidden facilities, but public displays of imperial power. Citizens walking through Rome could see children being abused in imperial parks, and anyone who objected was immediately executed. The emperor had normalized sexual violence to the point where child rape became a tourist attraction. Roman society had built a system where the person with the most power could commit any sexual crime imaginable, and everyone around them would not only allow it, but help make it happen. The emperor's sexual desires became more important than basic human rights, child protection, or moral decency. The entire civilization had been transformed into an enablement system for sexual predators. But imperial sexual madness reached its absolute worst with emperors who specialized in the systematic abuse of children. Some Roman emperors didn't just abuse children occasionally. They built systematic networks to procure, transport, and abuse kids across the empire. The most horrifying example was Emperor Tiberius, who ruled from 14 to 37 AD. After becoming emperor, Tiberius gradually withdrew from public life and spent his final years on the island of Capri, where he created what can only be described as an organized child abuse operation that would make modern trafficking networks look primitive. Historical records from Suetonius and other contemporary sources describe how Tiberius had young boys brought to Capri under the pretense of employment as servants or pages. These weren't voluntary positions. Children were essentially kidnapped from poor families across the empire and shipped to the emperor's private island where no one could witness what happened to them. The procurement system was sophisticated and systematic. Imperial agents, disguised as merchants or government officials, would travel throughout the empire identifying attractive children from vulnerable families. They would approach poor parents with offers of employment for their children at the imperial court, promising education, good food, and opportunities for advancement. Desperate families would hand over their children, never realizing they were selling them into sexual slavery. Tiberius called these boys his little fishes, and created elaborate games and scenarios for abusing them. According to historical accounts, he would have children as young as 7 or 8 trained to swim beneath him in his private pools and perform sexual acts underwater. He created a systematic program of sexual torture disguised as imperial entertainment. The children were trained like animals to perform specific sexual acts on command. The island of Capri was the perfect location for this abuse network. It was isolated, heavily guarded, and completely under imperial control. No visitors could arrive without Tiberius's permission. No messages could leave without his approval. The children brought there had no way to escape, no way to contact their families, and no way to ask for help. The entire island became a prison designed specifically for child abuse. But the systematic nature of this abuse is what makes it truly horrifying. This wasn't random violence, it was an organized operation with specific procedures for acquiring victims. Imperial agents would travel throughout the empire looking for attractive children from poor families. They would offer the families money or jobs for their children, then transport the kids to Capri, where they disappeared into the emperor's private compound. The children were sorted by age, appearance, and the emperor's specific preferences. Younger children were used for the pool games. Older boys were trained for different types of abuse. Some were kept as long-term sexual slaves, while others were used once and then disposed of. The entire operation was managed like a business, with record-keeping, scheduling, and systematic procurement procedures. Archaeological evidence from Capri supports these historical accounts. Excavations have revealed elaborate underground chambers connected to Tiberius's villa, designed specifically for sexual activities. These rooms contained restraining devices, torture implements, and drainage systems that suggest systematic abuse and disposal of victims. The architectural evidence confirms that Tiberius built his residence specifically to facilitate the sexual abuse of children. What makes this even more sickening is how the Roman system protected and enabled this abuse. Everyone in the imperial court knew what was happening on Capri, but no one dared speak out. Senators, generals, and government officials all participated in covering up the emperor's crimes because exposing them would mean death. The imperial court became a conspiracy of silence designed to protect a child abuser. The families of abused children had no legal recourse. If your child disappeared into the imperial system, you couldn't file complaints, demand investigations, or seek justice. The emperor's sexual desires legally superseded parental rights, child welfare, and basic human decency. The Roman legal system had created a framework where the most powerful person could abuse children with complete impunity. Roman law specifically exempted the emperor from all criminal prosecution, including crimes against children. Legal documents from the period make it clear that imperial sexual abuse was considered a privilege of office rather than a crime. The emperor could rape, torture, or murder anyone he chose, and the legal system would treat it as a legitimate exercise of imperial authority. Even more disturbing, other emperors studied and copied Tiberius's methods. Later rulers like Caligula and Commodus created their own child abuse networks, refining and expanding the systematic procurement and abuse of minors. What started as one emperor's sick obsession became a template for imperial behavior that continued for generations. Caligula inherited Tiberius's child abuse network and expanded it throughout the empire. He created what he called imperial nurseries in major cities where children were held for the sexual pleasure of government officials. These facilities operated openly with government funding and official protection. Roman citizens could see children being delivered to these facilities like livestock, and anyone who protested was executed for treason. Emperor Commodus took the system even further, creating a bureaucracy specifically for child procurement and abuse. He appointed government officials whose only job was to find attractive children and transport them to imperial facilities. He created official positions like Director of Imperial Pleasure and Supervisor of Child Procurement that were considered prestigious government appointments. This wasn't just individual criminal behavior, it was institutionalized child abuse, supported by the full resources of the Roman state. The empire's military, transportation, legal, and financial systems were all used to facilitate the systematic sexual abuse of children. Rome had become a child trafficking operation disguised as a government. The sexual horrors we've explored didn't just destroy individual lives, they created a culture of corruption that brought down the greatest empire in human history. When emperors normalized sexual abuse, rape, and child trafficking, they didn't just damage their victims. They created a political system where moral boundaries no longer existed. If the emperor could castrate children for sexual pleasure, what couldn't other powerful people get away with? If marriage was just legalized slavery, why should anyone respect family structures or social bonds? The systematic sexual abuse created a cascade of political disasters that historians have only recently begun to understand. Emperors who spent their time obsessing over teenage boys weren't managing the empire. Military commanders lost respect for leaders who were known child abusers. Foreign diplomats refused to negotiate with emperors who held wedding ceremonies with castrated slaves. The sexual corruption became a national security threat that undermined Rome's ability to function as a government. Contemporary accounts from foreign ambassadors described their horror at dealing with Roman leaders. Egyptian, Persian, and Germanic diplomats wrote detailed reports about the sexual madness they witnessed at the imperial court. These diplomatic records show how Rome's international reputation was destroyed by its sexual corruption, making it impossible to maintain alliances or negotiate treaties. The succession crises became increasingly chaotic as imperial families fell apart under the weight of sexual dysfunction. Emperors who abused their own family members created generations of damaged heirs who were psychologically unfit to rule. The Julio-Claudian dynasty, which included Tiberius, Caligula, and Nero, essentially destroyed itself through sexual violence and abuse. Consider the psychological damage inflicted on imperial heirs. Children raised in households where sexual abuse was normalized, where they witnessed the rape and murder of other children, where they themselves were sexually abused by their own relatives, could not possibly develop into healthy rulers. The imperial succession became a parade of psychologically damaged individuals who used their power to repeat and amplify the sexual crimes they had experienced as children. Regional governors and military commanders started rebelling not just against specific emperors, but against the entire imperial system. They refused to swear loyalty to leaders who had no moral authority. Provincial populations lost faith in Roman law when they realized it existed primarily to protect the sexual privileges of the elite, rather than maintain justice and order. Military records from the period show increasing rates of mutiny, desertion, and rebellion directly related to the sexual behavior of imperial leaders. Roman soldiers, who had traditionally taken pride in serving the empire, became ashamed of their association with sexually corrupt leaders. Foreign mercenaries refused to serve in Roman armies, and allied nations withdrew their military support. The economic costs were staggering and ultimately unsustainable. Emperors spent enormous amounts of public money on their sexual obsessions, building cities for dead boy lovers, maintaining child abuse networks, funding elaborate wedding ceremonies with slaves. Resources that should have gone to military defense, infrastructure, and administration were instead used to facilitate imperial sexual fantasies. Financial records that have survived show the enormous cost of imperial sexual corruption. Hadrian spent the equivalent of billions of modern dollars building cities and temples for his dead teenage lover. Nero's sexual entertainments consumed resources that could have funded entire military campaigns. The imperial child abuse networks required massive bureaucracies, transportation systems, and security apparatus that drained the imperial treasury. But the deepest damage was cultural and spiritual. Roman society had been built on concepts of duty, honor, and service to the state. When the head of state became a serial child abuser, these values became meaningless. If emperors could violate the most basic moral boundaries with impunity, why should citizens follow any laws or social norms? The normalization of sexual abuse created a society where exploitation became standard behavior at every level. If the emperor could own child sex slaves, why couldn't governors abuse their subjects? If marriage was just a property transaction, why should anyone respect marriage vows? If women had no legal rights, why should anyone protect the vulnerable? This moral collapse manifested in massive social problems that are documented in contemporary records. Increasing rates of violence, family breakdown, corruption in government and military, loss of civic virtue, and the gradual dissolution of the social bonds that held Roman civilization together. Roman writers of the period describe a society where traditional values had completely collapsed and been replaced by a culture of exploitation and abuse. Archaeological evidence supports these literary accounts. Excavations throughout the former Roman Empire show increasing evidence of violence, abandonment of traditional religious practices, breakdown of family structures, and the rise of alternative religious movements that explicitly rejected Roman values. The physical evidence shows a civilization in moral and social collapse. The empire didn't fall because of barbarian invasions or economic problems. It fell because the systematic sexual abuse of power had destroyed the moral foundation that made civilization possible. Barbarian leaders like Alaric and Attila explicitly cited Roman sexual corruption as justification for their invasions, claiming they were liberating civilized peoples from sexual predators. Contemporary barbarian writings describe Roman sexual practices with horror and disgust. Germanic and Celtic leaders used Roman sexual corruption as propaganda tools, convincing their own people and Roman subjects that barbarian rule would be morally superior to continued Roman domination. The sexual abuse had become so notorious that foreign conquerors were welcomed as moral liberators. The Germanic chieftain Arminius, who defeated Roman legions at the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, explicitly cited Roman sexual corruption in his war speeches. Surviving accounts describe how he told his warriors they were fighting to protect their children from Roman sexual predators. Celtic leaders in Britain used similar rhetoric when resisting Roman conquest, warning their people that Roman rule meant the systematic sexual abuse of their families. Even within the empire, provincial populations began actively supporting barbarian invasions as a way to escape Roman sexual tyranny. Archaeological evidence shows that many Roman cities opened their gates to barbarian armies without resistance, viewing foreign conquest as liberation from sexual oppression. Local populations would guide barbarian forces to Roman government buildings and military installations, actively collaborating in the destruction of the system that had abused them. The Christian Church, which eventually became the dominant religion in the late Roman Empire, gained power largely by promising protection from the sexual horrors of Roman culture. Early Christian writings are filled with condemnations of Roman sexual practices, and the Church's promise of sexual morality attracted millions of converts who were disgusted with imperial behavior. The rise of Christianity wasn't just a spiritual movement, it was a mass rejection of Roman sexual values. Christian monasteries became refuges for people fleeing Roman sexual culture. Parents would send their children to monasteries not for religious reasons, but to protect them from the systematic sexual abuse that characterized Roman society. Entire communities would convert to Christianity as a form of organized resistance to Roman sexual oppression. The economic devastation caused by sexual corruption extended far beyond imperial spending. The normalization of sexual violence created a society where productive economic activity became impossible. When women were treated as property and children were viewed as sexual commodities, normal family structures collapsed. Without stable families, there were no productive economic units to sustain the empire's wealth. Roman agricultural production declined dramatically as the sexual corruption destroyed rural communities. When local officials could sexually abuse farm families with impunity, farmers abandoned their land and fled to cities or barbarian territories. Archaeological surveys show massive rural depopulation during the late imperial period, directly correlating with increases in documented sexual violence by government officials. Trade networks collapsed as Roman merchants became known throughout the Mediterranean world for their sexual predation. Foreign trading partners refused to do business with Romans, who had developed a reputation for sexually abusing their business contacts' families during negotiations. Egyptian papyrus records describe how Greek and Syrian merchants would explicitly avoid Roman territories to protect their children from sexual assault. The military consequences of sexual corruption were equally devastating. Roman armies, once considered the finest fighting force in the world, became undisciplined mobs focused more on sexual conquest than military victory. Soldiers spent more time sexually abusing conquered populations than consolidating territorial gains, leading to constant rebellions and military disasters. Military discipline broke down completely when soldiers realized their commanders were more interested in procuring children for sexual abuse than winning battles. Desertion rates skyrocketed as Roman soldiers refused to participate in armies that had become criminal organizations focused on sexual violence rather than military objectives. Foreign mercenaries, who had once been eager to serve in Roman armies for the pay and prestige, began refusing Roman contracts. Word spread throughout the barbarian world that Roman military service involved participating in systematic sexual abuse, making it impossible for Rome to recruit the foreign fighters that had become essential to imperial defense. The legal system's complete subordination to sexual corruption made normal civic life impossible. Roman law had become nothing more than a framework for protecting the sexual privileges of the powerful while enabling the abuse of everyone else. Citizens lost all faith in legal institutions that existed primarily to facilitate rape and child abuse. Court proceedings became grotesque spectacles where judges would sexually abuse witnesses, lawyers, and even defendants during legal hearings. Legal documents from the late imperial period describe trials where sexual assault was so routine that court scribes would note it in official records as normal procedure. The entire legal system had been transformed into an instrument of sexual terrorism. Contract law became meaningless when every business agreement was understood to include the sexual availability of the contractor's family members. Roman legal codes from the late Empire explicitly state that business contracts could be voided if the contractor refused to provide sexual access to their wives or children. The economy couldn't function when every commercial transaction was also a sexual transaction. Property rights disappeared when powerful Romans could simply claim sexual access to anyone on another person's land as a form of taxation or tribute. Landowners found themselves unable to protect their families from sexual assault by government officials, military commanders, or anyone with political connections. Private property became meaningless when it couldn't protect the most basic human dignity. The rise of alternative religious movements throughout the empire represented a mass rejection of Roman sexual values. Mystery cults, Eastern religions, and eventually Christianity all gained followers by promising escape from the sexual horrors of Roman culture. These movements weren't just offering spiritual salvation, they were offering practical protection from systematic sexual abuse. Archaeological evidence from religious sites throughout the empire shows that alternative religious communities built extensive defensive structures designed specifically to protect members from sexual assault. Christian communities created underground networks to hide children from imperial procurement agents. Eastern mystery cults developed elaborate screening procedures to ensure that their religious gatherings weren't infiltrated by sexual predators. The cult of Mithras, popular among Roman soldiers, explicitly rejected the sexual corruption of imperial culture. Mithraic religious texts describe sexual purity as essential for spiritual advancement, directly contradicting Roman cultural values. Military units that converted to Mithraism often refused to participate in the sexual violence that had become routine in Roman armies. Jewish communities throughout the empire became centers of resistance to Roman sexual culture. Jewish religious law explicitly prohibited the sexual practices that Romans considered normal, making Jewish communities natural refuges for people fleeing sexual oppression. Roman authorities frequently persecuted Jewish communities specifically because they provided alternatives to Roman sexual values. The administrative breakdown caused by sexual corruption made effective governance impossible. Government officials at every level were more focused on sexual exploitation than administrative duties. Tax collection became a form of sexual extortion, with collectors demanding sexual access to family members in addition to monetary payments. Provincial governors appointed administrators based on their willingness to participate in sexual corruption rather than their administrative competence. Government positions became rewards for sexual predators rather than qualified civil servants. The entire imperial bureaucracy transformed into a criminal organization focused on facilitating sexual abuse. Communication networks throughout the empire broke down as government messengers and postal workers sexually abused the families of people they encountered during their duties. Information flow became impossible when every government communication was also an opportunity for sexual assault. Military intelligence collapsed when scouts and messengers spent more time sexually abusing local populations than gathering strategic information. Infrastructure maintenance ceased as engineers and construction workers were more focused on sexual exploitation than building maintenance. Roads, bridges, aqueducts, and public buildings throughout the empire fell into disrepair because the people responsible for maintaining them were too busy committing sexual crimes to do their jobs. The demographic collapse caused by sexual corruption was catastrophic and irreversible. Constant sexual violence and the systematic abuse of women and children made normal reproduction impossible. Birth rates plummeted throughout the empire as families disintegrated under the pressure of systematic sexual assault. Life expectancy dropped dramatically as sexual violence became the leading cause of death for women and children. Roman medical texts from the late Empire describe epidemics of sexually transmitted diseases that killed thousands of people. The normalization of sexual abuse created public health disasters that overwhelmed the empire's medical capacity. Population centers throughout the empire experienced massive outmigration as people fled to barbarian territories to escape sexual oppression. Archaeological evidence shows that many Roman cities lost half their population during the late imperial period, with entire neighborhoods abandoned as residents fled sexual violence. The cultural destruction was equally complete. Roman literature, art, and intellectual life collapsed as creative activity became impossible in a society dominated by sexual violence. Writers, artists, and philosophers fled to barbarian territories or alternative religious communities where intellectual work was possible without constant fear of sexual assault. Educational institutions throughout the empire closed as parents refused to send their children to schools where sexual abuse was routine. The famous Roman legal schools, rhetoric academies, and philosophical institutions that had made Roman civilization intellectually prestigious became known as centers of child sexual abuse rather than learning. Libraries and archives throughout the empire were abandoned or destroyed as literacy became associated with sexual corruption. The preservation of knowledge became impossible when educational institutions existed primarily to facilitate the sexual abuse of students rather than intellectual development. The transformation of Roman culture from a civilization based on law, military prowess, and civic virtue into a criminal organization focused on sexual exploitation represents one of the most complete moral collapses in human history. The empire that had once been synonymous with order, justice, and civilization became a byword for sexual violence and abuse. Foreign visitors to the late Roman Empire described a society that had become completely unrecognizable from its earlier incarnation. Diplomatic reports from Persian, Indian, and Chinese ambassadors describe a civilization that had abandoned all pretense of moral authority and existed solely to facilitate the sexual exploitation of its own population. The Roman Empire's greatest lesson isn't about military strategy or political organization. It's about what happens when societies allow powerful people to commit sexual crimes without consequences. When leaders can abuse children, enslave women, and use sex as a weapon of control, the entire social system eventually collapses under the weight of its own corruption. Modern democracies exist precisely because we learned from Rome's mistakes. Our concepts of human rights, legal equality, and institutional checks on power were developed specifically to prevent the kind of systematic sexual abuse that destroyed the Roman Empire. Every law protecting children, every legal right for women, every limitation on executive power exists because we saw what happened when Rome allowed absolute power to corrupt absolutely. The sexual horrors that destroyed Rome weren't aberrations or historical curiosities. They were the predictable result of a system that prioritized power over human dignity. The emperors who built child abuse networks, held wedding ceremonies with castrated slaves, and turned marriage into legalized slavery weren't monsters separate from their society. They were the logical endpoint of a culture that treated sexuality as a tool of domination rather than an expression of human connection. The fall of Rome teaches us that no civilization is so powerful, so advanced, or so successful that it can survive the systematic sexual corruption of its leadership. When societies allow their most powerful members to commit sexual crimes with impunity, they don't just damage individual victims, they destroy the moral foundation that makes civilization possible. The archaeological record tells the complete story of this collapse. Excavations throughout the former Roman Empire show clear evidence of the transition from a functioning civilization to a failed state consumed by sexual violence. The physical evidence supports every horrible detail we've discussed, from the underground chambers in Tiberius's villa designed for child abuse to the abandoned cities where populations fled sexual oppression. Skeletal remains from Roman graveyards show the horrific toll of systematic sexual violence. Female skeletons display evidence of repeated sexual trauma, while child remains show signs of sexual abuse that would be considered evidence of systematic torture by modern forensic standards. The bones themselves tell the story of a civilization that had lost all moral boundaries. Material culture from the late Roman period reflects the complete collapse of normal social values. Household artifacts, artwork, and personal belongings show a society obsessed with sexual dominance and violence. Even everyday objects like pottery, jewelry, and coins were decorated with imagery celebrating sexual abuse and domination. The documentary evidence is equally overwhelming. Thousands of Roman legal documents, letters, and official records detail the systematic sexual corruption that destroyed the empire. These aren't vague historical accounts. They're detailed bureaucratic records of how an entire civilization organized itself around sexual exploitation. Tax records show government revenues being diverted to fund child procurement networks. Military dispatches describe armies more focused on sexual conquest than territorial defense. Diplomatic correspondence documents how Roman sexual corruption destroyed international relationships and made the empire a pariah among civilized nations. Personal letters that have survived provide heartbreaking accounts of individual families destroyed by Roman sexual culture. Parents writing about their children being taken by imperial agents. Wives describing their systematic sexual abuse by their husbands and his associates. Children documenting their own sexual exploitation by Roman authorities. The religious texts that emerged during the collapse of Roman civilization provide detailed condemnations of Roman sexual practices. Christian writings, Jewish religious documents, and pagan philosophical texts all describe the systematic sexual corruption that had consumed Roman society. These sources provide eyewitness accounts of how sexual abuse had become the defining characteristic of Roman civilization. Medical texts from the period document the public health consequences of systematic sexual violence. Roman physicians wrote detailed accounts of sexually transmitted diseases, sexual trauma, and the psychological damage caused by widespread sexual abuse. These medical documents provide clinical evidence of how sexual corruption had created a public health catastrophe. The economic records paint a clear picture of how sexual corruption destroyed Roman prosperity. Trade documents show the collapse of commercial networks as Roman merchants became known for sexual predation. Financial records document the enormous costs of maintaining imperial child abuse networks and funding the sexual entertainment of corrupt officials. Agricultural records show the systematic destruction of rural communities as sexual violence made farming impossible. Population surveys document massive demographic collapse as people fled Roman territories to escape sexual oppression. Infrastructure maintenance records show how sexual corruption made basic civic functions impossible. So there you have it, the real story of how sexual horror destroyed the Roman Empire. The most powerful men in history weren't noble warriors or brilliant leaders. They were sexual predators who used their absolute authority to commit crimes that would horrify us today. Their systematic abuse didn't just destroy lives, it destroyed the greatest empire in human history. Makes modern political scandals look like playground disputes, doesn't it? At least our leaders don't build cities for their dead teenage boyfriends or hold wedding ceremonies with castrated children. The end. The Roman Empire's greatest lesson isn't about military strategy or political organization. It's about what happens when societies allow powerful people to commit sexual crimes without consequences. When leaders can abuse children, enslave women, and use sex as a weapon of control, the entire social system eventually collapses under the weight of its own corruption. Modern democracies exist precisely because we learned from Rome's mistakes. Our concepts of human rights, legal equality, and institutional checks on power were developed specifically to prevent the kind of systematic sexual abuse that destroyed the Roman Empire. Every law protecting children, every legal right for women, every limitation on executive power exists because we saw what happened when Rome allowed absolute power to corrupt absolutely. The sexual horrors that destroyed Rome weren't aberrations or historical curiosities. They were the predictable result of a system that prioritized power over human dignity. The emperors who built child abuse networks, held wedding ceremonies with castrated slaves, and turned marriage into legalized slavery weren't monsters separate from their society. They were the logical endpoint of a culture that treated sexuality as a tool of domination rather than an expression of human connection. The fall of Rome teaches us that no civilization is so powerful, so advanced, or so successful that it can survive the systematic sexual corruption of its leadership. When societies allow their most powerful members to commit sexual crimes with impunity, they don't just damage individual victims. They destroy the moral foundation that makes civilization possible. So there you have it, the real story of how sexual horror destroyed the Roman Empire. The most powerful men in history weren't noble warriors or brilliant leaders. They were sexual predators who used their absolute authority to commit crimes that would horrify us today. Their systematic abuse didn't just destroy lives, it destroyed the greatest empire in human history. Makes modern political scandals look like playground disputes, doesn't it? At least our leaders don't build cities